Okay, study number 4, baptism in water. This is going to be 8 episodes, and this first episode, I just want to introduce to you the fact that baptism is important. Now, I haven't gotten to the point yet to say whether or not it's essential to salvation. We'll answer that question eventually, but right now, I just want to show to you from Scripture that baptism is important to God. In Matthew chapter 28 and verses 19 through 20, you may remember this is the Great Commission where Jesus sends out his 12 disciples after his resurrection, and he tells them several things. Now, I'm sure that a lot of what Jesus tells, Matthew, John, Peter, and all the 12 apostles, at that point 11, before he ascends into heaven, he includes more than what Matthew says. But take into consideration that of what Matthew heard from Jesus on those last few moments, I'm sure that every single word they were just in awe of. He decided to write down only a little bit that we have there toward the end of Matthew 28, the last chapter of his gospel. Of what he did include there, he does include the fact that Jesus said, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them." And so he triaged out all the words of Jesus and said, I'm going to include these words at the end of my gospel to capture what he said right before he left us. Because he included baptism in that, it leaves me with the impression that baptism is very important. Now, another passage which is kind of a backwards way of showing how important baptism is, and it was obviously important to the early churches, when you go to the book of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, there were a lot of problems. They were divided against one another over several things. One of the things that Paul mentions in the first few chapters is how some people were following Apollos and some were following Paul. And instead of following just Christ, they were deciding who was their favorite preacher, more or less, and saying, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Paul. More or less, what they were arguing about is that Paul baptized me, Apollos baptized me, the other person would say. One person might say, well, Paul was the best apostle of all the apostles. He's the most knowledgeable and so on and so forth. The other one might say, well, Apollos is the most eloquent preacher that you have ever heard, if you're being honest with yourself. And so in that way, they understood that baptism was very important. And because it was so important, they thought it was I guess, more or less impressive who baptized them. The third passage that I might go to show that baptism is important is in Ephesians chapter 4. And in this passage, I just tell people, this passage shows that baptism keeps good company. And sometimes I like to personify characteristics and so forth. And so let's personify baptism for just a moment. If you were to watch baptism, assuming he was a person, walking down the street, and you saw what company he was keeping, you would think, man, I want to be friends with baptism. And I say that in light of Ephesians chapter 4 and verses 4 through 5. That's where Paul says, there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling. One Lord, one faith, one baptism. This mentioning of baptism is with a list of 7 other things that are very important to the Christian faith. And so at least we get the impression that baptism is important.